If you haven't already done so, click on subscribe now and turn on notifications to get alerts when the next episode of The Black Ship is out. Now, on with the story. Your Majesty, allow me to thank you for accepting my request for an audience, Istenel said after bowing deeply. Much to Wyatt's surprise, Istenel wasn't merely posturing or showing submission, he was being genuinely cordial and respectful. Still, he eyed the man closely as he moved to an upright position. Clara and Cynthia, however, were less than amused. You are here to represent your Lord Father, Sir Istenel. As your host, it would be most unbecoming of me to deny you so without reason. I'm surprised you haven't done so earlier. Ever since you boarded my ship, you have not left your quarters except to wander about aimlessly. If I were one to fear being double-crossed by Lord Geenock, I would suspect you to be a spy, trying to steal the secrets held within my ship, Clara replied in her icy, measured tone. Perish the thought, Istenel replied with a placid, practiced smile. I'm hardly interested in technology, and I do not have the skills to indulge myself in subterfuge. My exploration was merely scholarly in nature and to satiate my curiosity. The man approached the trio, standing tall, proud, and unafraid. With a gesture from Clara's hand, Istenel sat down on an available couch, while Cynthia quickly presented him with a warm cup of tea and a tray of pastries. My thanks, Your Majesty. You are by far much more amicable than I feared, and, do forgive me for saying this, much more open-minded than I expected. For royalty to consider owning aliens, more so a dutiful and dignified daughter of House Astor, is such a welcome turn of events that I simply must applaud your forward thinking. No offense has been spoken, but do enlighten me, Istenel, for I was unaware that I owned the Icontis serving in my ship. A contract was offered and signed. Nothing more, Clara replied, her voice projecting an added weight to each spoken word. Semantics in all essence, Your Majesty, Istenel replied, smirking before taking a bite out of a small cake and washing it down with a sip of tea. They are beautiful examples of their species, but they are aliens. This is an undeniable truth. Thus, beneath humanity. Thus, their value hardly can be compared to that of a mere commoner. Clara remained silent and still for several seconds until she reached for a cookie, eating half of it slowly, her eyes fixated on her elegant guest. Our opinions differ, but you aren't entirely incorrect. They are useful on this, I agree, but this by no means that I own them. Then let not our contrary opinions dictate disharmony between us, Istenel was quick to reply. That said, my praise remains. Unlike many others, we both see the value and worth aliens bring to humanity. We, you and I specifically, wouldn't be here if the humanity from old Earth hadn't seen such potential and wonder to explore the cosmos, to further humanity beyond limitations and expand our seeds across the stars. Not all aliens are worthwhile, but there are those that we can learn from aplenty. You are rather forward, Istenel, and you speak much without saying anything, Clara replied, sipping from her cup. One must be cautious when approaching such subjects, Your Majesty. Truly, I've been wounded by your actions, my princess. I have not been invited to join a single reunion with your chosen senior staff in regard to the strategies planned to retake Hastrung and deal with the invaders, Istenel replied. I was not aware that you were a tactical advisor or a strategist, Istenel, but even if you were, I would not have extended an invitation. You are here as an observer, so your Lord Father may be satisfied with the deal struck. Your opinion is of no use nor interest to me in such delicate matters, Clara countered coldly and firmly. Istenel smirked, nodding in approval. Ah, now I understand. Yes, my expertise lies in other fields. Fighting for life and limb, for honor and glory is such a foolish undertaking. Let those with no intelligence or talent for the finer things in life risk their lives in pointless struggles and conflict, he proclaimed, before taking another bite out of his cake. We few are more civilized and deserving of our status. A true blue blood through and through, Wyatt thought with revulsion and contempt, as each declaration made by the long-haired man only decreased his already low opinion of him. If there was one thing that he had to admit, though, was the fact that Istenel wasn't afraid of Clara, at all. There was no posturing when he addressed her, no fear of speaking out of turn, and he wasn't stiff as if expecting to be struck at any moment. Was it overconfidence, or was it something else at play? Isn't that interesting? "What is your field of expertise, Istanel?" asked the princess. "I'm a xenobiologist, Your Majesty. I specialize in the study and understanding of sapient and sophont alien species. Exotic alien species are hard to come by, and I assure you that my understanding of Yikanti and Drazen is unmatched. Why, even the ever-elusive Kolgadon and the distant Jaconian fall within the depths of my knowledge," Istanel boasted. "That is why I am offended, my princess. I may not be able to provide strategic ideas or plans of attack, but my knowledge regarding the Drazen is unmatched. Fascinating organisms, all things considered. Truly magnificent." "Fascinating?" Wyatt spoke as a fire erupted inside his belly, eyes narrowing as he pierced Istanel with his glare. "Magnificent! The Drazen are monsters, every single one of them. What could be so fascinating about them?" "Wyatt!" Clara spoke, her tone firm but understanding. Wyatt closed his eyes and turned to her, bowing his head in submission for a brief moment. "Forgive my companion's outburst, Istanel. He is rather animated whenever the Drazen is a topic of conversation." "That is clear," Istanel replied, smiling widely. "Your display was utterly breathtaking. Your shots were precise. A real Drazen would have perished on the spot, Sir Wyatt Staples. Under other circumstances, my fury would have been great. I commissioned the creation of those statues to a talented sculptor and were incredibly expensive. Many make the mistake of aiming for their top eye stalks, but you? You went for the kill in a fraction of a second. Are you perchance a hunter?" Istanel asked, then quickly shocked his head. Forgive me. I did not mean to pry. As part of Princess Clara's entourage, your skills must remain a secret. But by your tone and abrupt interjection, I gather that you must know how to, at the very least, deal with the Drazen?" Wyatt stared at the man for a long moment before a voice rang inside his head. "Speak freely, but mind your temper. Do not openly insult him," was Clara's command. Taking a deep breath, the fire inside him turned to smoldering embers, hot but manageable. "Yes, I am familiar with the Drazen, Lord Istanel. Whilst I doubt your familiarity comes from a point of scholarly and intellectual interest, your knowledge is palpable and admirable. Speaking of admirable actions, Sir Wyatt, allow me to congratulate you on your most deserved ennoblement," Istanel said sincerely. "Mere moments ago, you showcased your apathy toward commoners, Istanel. I do not sense mockery coming from your words. This is a rather unexpected turn of events," said Clara, mildly intrigued. "The prince himself has deemed you worthy of joining the nobility, not through bribe or gifts, but through loyal service. Who am I to argue against his decision? The shackles of a commoner life have been lifted. You stand among those truly deserving of being called human. Unlike the servile, unintelligent, feces-throwing monkeys humanity evolved from, and that commoners seem to love so much to the point of imitating their behavior," Istanel explained with disdain, but lacking any malicious intent. "It was never my goal to be rewarded by our liege in such a way," Wyatt replied. "But you were rewarded indeed. That's all that should matter. Every fool who feels threatened by your ascension should be ashamed of themselves. I, for one, welcome you with open arms, Sir Wyatt. May your exploits be great and your deeds properly rewarded," Istanel acclaimed before taking another sip of tea. "I only seek to serve so this conflict may end quickly. Loyalty is its own reward," Wyatt replied firmly, "and loyalty can be rewarding. Never forget that, Sir Wyatt." "As much as I hate to agree with this haughty blue blood, he's right about that," thought the pilot. "You mentioned that your knowledge could be useful. How?" Clara questioned before the conversation could spiral out of control, reining in the smiling Istanel. "Ah, yes. Forgive me for that momentary distraction. Your Majesty, how much do you know about the Drazen?" he asked before taking another sip of tea. "More than I've ever desired to know. Do you have a secret weapon that may help us win against them?" Clara asked. "I doubt it, my princess. Otherwise, House Ferentis would not need our help in reclaiming their fallen system, which begs the question, how have you failed to reclaim it?" Cynthia added, her voice stoic, firm, and coarse as sandpaper. "Lack of military might in both aspects and pride to not call upon the Royal Navy for support. The rebels were always well organized and never made themselves to be anything more than a minor annoyance in the past. Their assaults and criminal activities were sequestered only in their neighboring systems. The scope and range of their operation began to change when the leader of their rebellion, a filthy rat unworthy of a name, died, and his eldest son took over 4 years ago. My father was starting to amass resources and make plans to bring the battle to them and retake the system, but then Duke Draymore instigated his coup and his plans shifted, Istenel replied openly. There were odd movements registered months and weeks prior to the coup's strike. Drazan signatures were detected, pirate and smuggling activity increased tenfold, several civilian ships were captured, and stations were raided. They were preparing for something. For what? It remains a mystery. The Drazan assaulted Hastrung in force, and the rest you know. They achieved to do something my house could not achieve in 30 years. It says a lot about their capabilities, don't you think so? It says to me that they are dangerous and that they must be destroyed at once, Clara replied coldly. Ah, yes, destroy. Such a troublesome thing, Istenel commented, causing Clara to raise an eyebrow. Princess Clara, would you be interested in a mutually beneficial arrangement? Clara stared at Istenel for the longest moment before reaching for her cup, taking a sip from it, and placing the cup down with delicate practice. Curious. If this were to be of imperative importance, Lord Geenock would have mentioned it back in Balakura. Yet here you are with a proposition that was not spoken before until now. This means that you do not speak with the authority of your father, Istenel. What could you possibly offer? Taking another sip from her tea, finishing it, she placed it down only for Cynthia to refill her cup with a fresh, hot pouring. You are also different from others. Do you not fear me? Istenel smirked, tilting his head and running a hand across his long, lavish, shimmering hair. Why should I fear you, Clara? At the use of her name, Cynthia stiffened, glaring blue, icy dagger at the insolent noble. Should I fear the princess, or should I fear the Reaper? Should I fear Sir Wyatt, or should I fear the blue-haired demon better known as the Bloodrend? A chuckle left Istenel's mouth as it rumbled in his throat. Rest assured, Princess, I do not fear you whatsoever. Clara smiled back at him, coy and playful, but also defiant. Oh, that's incredibly brave, Istenel. Few are those that can claim such a thing. Fewer still those who can carry the weight of that claim. Istenel leaned back in his seat. There is no ulterior motive nor mystery behind my lack of fear, Your Majesty. Why should I fear you? I've done nothing that could possibly earn your wrath. And those rumors of bloodthirst? Ridiculous. You are a princess and a proud member of House Astor. If you wanted to spill blood and mount heads on pikes, all you had to do was order it so and it would be done. You're no monster without reason. I may not agree with your reasoning for sentencing so many noble lives, ending their precious bloodlines and their houses, but I do not stand against it either. How reassuring it is to hear that there are those who can see reality, Clara replied with a chuckle, her voice shifting to a more friendly and warm tone. In light of your honesty and my lifted spirits, I will entertain your proposition. Istenel lowered his head before replying. My princess, we know not what we'll be facing in Hastrung, and I'm not arrogant enough to assume you will fight regardless against overwhelming odds. If a battle is to be had, I would like for your forces to capture at least 100 Drazan alive, and if at all possible, up to 1,000 or more. My funds are vast, and I can pay handsomely for each captured Drazan. They are, of course, to be sedated or constrained until they can be handed over to me safely back on Balakura. Wyatt heard Istenel's proposition in utter bafflement, and was too stunned to react until he was done. Even Cynthia had her mouth agape in shock, while Clara stared at the noble the same way one would stare at a particularly ugly stain on the floor. He wanted to shout at the man for such an idiotic and beyond stupid proposition, but Clara's order was present in his mind, and he just barely managed to contain the urge to go and help Istenel eat his food on account of taking a few of his teeth. Luckily for him, Clara regained her composure soon after. Are you testing me, Istenel, or is this merely a joke? I assure you, Princess, it is neither. I wish to acquire living specimens for my studies and personal uses, Istenel answered. You see, the Drazan are incredible life forms. Even with my resources at hand, getting a hold of living Drazan is almost impossible. They don't sell their kind out for anything, as they are communal and fiercely protective of one another. The collective is far away, and entering their territory is a death sentence. The raiders are the only viable source of gathering information, fresh samples, and subjects to conduct studies and experiments upon. Capturing them, however, is a different story. Why would you want to willingly invite those monsters into your homeworld? Wyatt asked with a heavy tone. Invite? Hardly. As much as I'd like to converse with a Drazan scholar, their xenophobia and supremacist views are well documented. No, I wish to experiment on them. See if my theories and the investigations I've read are true or falsehood. My aim is to write a guide and a book portraying such a magnificent species. With a smile, he turned to Wyatt. Were you aware that the Drazan we know today started as 3 different species? A type of small reptile, a carnivorous plant, and a fungi? Their relationship was one of mutualism. The plant attracted prey with its sweet, potent smells. The fungi protected it from rival plants and the reptile from small insects and parasites. Over time, and as evolution continued on their homeworld, the 3 species slowly merged into one being, with the plant species evolving, adapting, and in the end gaining traits and aspects from the other 2 until, a few million years ago, the ancestors of the Drazan we know today emerged on their homeworld. I couldn't care less about this pointless history lesson. What does it matter if it doesn't help us kill more Drazan? Wyatt protested in his mind as he glared with fiery intensity at the delusional noble. I know what you're thinking. What is the purpose of such knowledge? The answer is simple. To battle something, you need to understand it. I seek to understand the Drazan, how their bodies truly work, and develop a means to better contain them. If possible, I'd like to test my theory and see if their extreme xenophobia is a learned cultural trait or an evolutionary one. Their aversion to harming others of their species, working together almost seamlessly, and their strong unity are other aspects I wish to catalog and study. Therefore, I need a large population of living, unharmed Drazan. I would keep them in a secluded zoological laboratory, of course. Who knows? Perhaps we humans could learn a thing or two about the Drazan. Their complete abhorrence to the idea of harming other Drazan is one such trait I wish to emulate. Imagine if the risk of rebellion could be eradicated, replaced not with cruel obedience, but a biological key preventing commoners from trying to harm each other and, most importantly, their betters. That is what you wish to achieve? Clara asked, unshaken. I don't know if it can be possible, Your Majesty. That is why I need Drazan. The more I learn about them, the more possibilities for new discoveries and implementations could be discovered. As a scholar and a man of science, I cannot allow this opportunity to go to waste. Surely even you, Sir Wyatt, must appreciate the search for knowledge, Istenel replied, smiling. The only thing I wish to discover about the Drazan is if they can scream when they burn, the pilot replied dryly. Incidentally, yes, they do scream if they are burned. Unsurprisingly, they do not like fire, yet need it as much as we do in a technological aspect. They're not as flammable as humans are, but they will burn all the same. They communicate through visual means using their top stalk in complex patterns and arrays of color that go outside our normal visual spectrum, so they don't have vocal cords. They have no need for them, but they can feel pain. If the pain is intense enough, they let out a most unpleasant wail. Wyatt smiled involuntarily at the confirmation of one of his deepest desires. Even in the academy, information about the Drazan was sketchy at best, but he learned it well through his own investigation during his few visits to Woodshaft in the past. Few were those that survived an encounter against the Drazan, after all. It took him a moment to regain senses, but when he did, he noticed Istenel was staring at him intently, fear and awe mixed, crowding his expression. I apologize for my outburst, Lord, said the black-haired man, his expression returning to a stoic one. My, what an interesting reaction. I was caught off guard by it. Now I fully understand why you didn't linger on your duty. Commendable and quite impressive, Sir Wyatt, Istenel remarked a few seconds later, impressed. You've got yourself a most peculiar individual to serve you, my princess. No wonder you've incorporated him into your inner circle. He is quite useful and surprising in many fields, Istenel, Clara replied with care. Alas, Istenel, I'm afraid whatever knowledge you possess is useless to me. I seek to destroy the Drazan. No boarding actions have been planned. We simply do not have the numbers to carry such an operation without great risk. Istenel nodded. I understand, Your Majesty. However, things change in the heat of battle. Why, we don't even have solid information regarding the enemy. But what I can tell you freely is that the Drazan, no matter how strong their raiding fleets were, couldn't have gone unscathed against the rebels infesting Hastrung. Their defenses were formidable, with numerous defensive satellites, outposts, and according to the intelligence reports, 4 heavily armed stations and dozens of refitted ships. I was aware. Your father shared such information before our departure, Clara replied. Then it seems my bargaining power has been spent. A shame. Alas, do keep my proposal in mind, Princess. If the situation is to shift and the possibility of capture opens, you have a lucrative option at your disposal, not to mention my personal favor. I may not be an heir apparent, but my support can be incredibly useful in these tumultuous times. Finishing his tea, he stood up, bowed politely, and turned to leave. Thank you for granting me such a lovely audience, my princess. I desire your prompt victory as much as you do. Farewell. With that, Istanel Ferentis left the room without fanfare. Seconds after he was gone, Clara let out a heavy sigh. That was something, she proclaimed before greedily eating 2 cookies and drinking the full cup in a single go. Cynthia? His proposal is sensible. I personally wouldn't give it any further thought, but it may be something to be considered, the bodyguard replied before refilling her friend's empty cup. I doubt he has more credits than any of you have, Wyatt offered his opinion. Cynthia shook her head. Forget any monetary recompense, Wyatt. His support would prove invaluable. He is beloved by Yashivi, and his influence is heavy. Why else would Geenock allow him to place his horrid sculptures in such an important place? A doted son can be dangerous, but as far as I can tell, he'd be a useful tool. I'm far more surprised that he spoke truthfully the entire time. Not a single lie or attempt at deception left his lips, Clara hummed. It is a strange sensation to not be feared by a member of a powerful house. Yes, he could prove to be a useful tool, maybe even an ally. Her eyes narrowed slightly. But what he asks for... You're not considering granting his request, are you? Wyatt asked hurriedly. I don't have the luxury to decide that just yet, Wyatt. His arguments weren't compelling, his goals and intentions less so, but his assured support in addition to Geenock's compromise? It is a tempting offer. All I can say is that unless the opportunity presents itself, any attempts at boarding Drazan ships will not be considered, replied the princess. Wyatt crossed his arms and pinched his chin for a few moments, deep in thought. On one side, he loathed the idea of taking Drazan as prisoners. To him, that was a kindness not a single one of them deserved. On the other hand, though, seeing so many of them gathered in one place was not a common sight. If Drazan high-ranking officers could be captured and interrogated for their information, that could aid them greatly. I made the mistake of rushing to a conclusion without considering other options before. They were only pirates, but there were many innocent children and babies aboard. This isn't the same, but if we can prevent future Drazan assaults or know what their plans are, that should end up in more dead Drazan and more lives saved in the long run. The prospect of burning, screaming, dying Drazan fueled him nicely. No matter how they died, as long as they burned, he'd be more than happy to do anything in his power to achieve that goal. If that meant capturing some of them alive, then that was a price he was more than willing to pay. He was snapped out of his deep thinking when Clara clapped her hands twice. Turning to her, he found her smiling warmly. "Let us put this moment behind us and focus on something far more productive?" asked the blonde princess. Wyatt smiled. He could worry about the Drazan later. Out in the vastness of space, a cloud of stellar dust moved aimlessly through stellar winds until a sudden explosion of light pierced through the darkness, dispelling the cloud and all nearby particles and specks of rock, metal, and frozen liquids in all directions. A large bubble distorted the space around it for a fraction of a second before it ruptured, returning the space it had disturbed to normal, as if it had never happened. Instead of a bubble, a large vessel now occupied its place. "Jump successful, exit drift within expected parameters, no large stellar bodies detected in our vicinity," Galt Tirome said, unable to hide the relief in his voice, and sighed, thankful the jump had been a success, a sentiment shared across the rest of the Noir Navio. "Ready to launch probes at your behest, Commander Redford." Sitting on the captain's chair, Redford Callan was linked to the ship itself. He took a moment to drink in the experience once more. No matter how many times he connected with the ship, the experience was always surreal. He had commanded ships before, of course, but the experience was never so vivid. In truth, he didn't need his implants to connect with the ship, much like Wyatt had done on Gintrax, but they made it so much easier. Not only that, the systems of the ship streamlined the processes needed, lessening the burden on his mind. A commanding officer could only last a few hours connected to any regular Principality ship before the strain became dangerous. With the Noir Navio, the same length of time was barely a noticeable burden on his mind. At the same time, the sensation of being one with the ship was magnified tenfold. In truth, he still couldn't comprehend how his chosen second-in-command had managed to do what he did in the first place. He could only speculate that his injuries and intense, deadly focus had prevented his mind from being overloaded up until the strain and his wounds were too much for him to fight against. Only 3 seconds had passed for him, his experience to the diminished perception of time after decades of loyal service shining through. "Launch the probes!" came his order, as at the same time the engines came to life and the Noir Navio began to move steadily into the system. The hangar opened, and 5 Raptor fighter-sized cylindrical objects were ejected into space. Moments later, the hangar closed, and 5 plumes of light pushed the probes further ahead of the Noir Navio. The probes were little more than a propulsion engine attached to a powerful sensor array and a data-exchanging device. The plumes began to move apart from each other quickly, and soon after they were lost across the boundless space, undetectable by sheer virtue of their size and the vastness of the void. "Probes launched, Commander. Their signals are strong and steady," Galt informed. "Maintain connection at intervals," ordered Redford. Diving deep within the ship's systems, Redford quickly checked all systems. Everything was nominal. The core was operating under specifications, the shields were sitting at a stable 30% power, the boogeyman outer hull was working perfectly, the heat sinks were empty, and the excess heat was below normal parameters. The crew had been informed and were doing extra rounds, ensuring everything was in order and accounted for. Supplies, body armor, escape pods, weapons, ammunition, for handheld weapons and for the ship's weaponry, triple-check security stations, and a myriad of other tests and checks that fell upon the duties of his head officers. But the tension was palpable across the entirety of the ship. He couldn't blame any of them for feeling anxious when he was experiencing the same. Fighting against the Drazen was always a tricky business. They never fought unless they believed victory would be theirs, preferring to strike against weak, isolated, or remote zones where aid was unlikely to come soon. Fighting them in a fortified area had never occurred before, as most assaults against the murderous aliens were launched against lonely ships or through successful ambushes. The rules of engagement didn't apply to the Drazen, but several stubborn and arrogant commanding officers insisted on fighting with honor rather than with intelligence. Most of them were dead, their ships and crews lost with them thanks to their poor tactical choices. There was also the issue of the traitors. He had managed to lose them, but that was a double-edged sword that played in their favor too. Clara was certain they were doing more than just following them, a sentiment he shared with the woman he loved as a niece. There were no assurances on what Felicity Sintor would do, but he doubted that she would fight them in the open. His mind was divided between believing the traitors would simply flee now that their mark had eluded them and an attack of opportunity. The Redford from his youth would have believed the first option as the only viable solution. Now, he knew better. Were he in Felicity's position, he'd try to take down a wounded enemy or catch him by surprise. He only hoped that Felicity's actions would not disturb the Drazen too much. For now, he disconnected from the chair and stood up, leaving the navigational AI to follow the course set in motion. There was nothing more to do, only the wait remained. The calm before the storm had arrived with a thunderous clap of silence. Noir Navio, War Room. "What are we seeing, Redford?" Clara asked as she stared at the holographic display of the Hastrung system that the probes provided a little over a day after their initial launch. Without a warp signature to announce their arrival, the probes had not been detected by the enemy, giving them a significant upper hand. Wyatt looked at the map intently. The Hastrung system was surprisingly small, with an orange dwarf main sequence star, 7 rocky planets, 2 gas giants, and a dense asteroid belt. The largest gas giant had rings, whilst the second, and much smaller than the first, was the last large body in the system, excluding rogue planetoids. The rocky planets were mostly unimportant, with only 4 of them having signs of development and industry on their surface. The 4th planet, a vibrant and lush planet, was habitable and the main point of interest. According to the data sent by the probes, there were 12 Drazen signatures in high orbit across the planet. There were 8 destroyer-class ships and 3 cruiser-class ships, with 2 more destroyer-class ships patrolling a zone near the usual lane that connected Hastrung to the neighboring system, Kaltashi. It was the last signal that concerned everyone present, him included. If the signal was to be believed, the monstrosity was at least 12 kilometers in length, 3 in diameter, and defended by half the ships set around it. Looking around the room, he found nothing but uncertainty. "That, my princess, is something I've never thought I'd come to see with my own eyes. It's a Drazen cattle ship, a veritable moving station for all intents and purposes," explained Redford with narrowed eyes. "That thing alone can house hundreds of thousands of Drazen, and their cattle." "The shape is familiar," Cynthia mentioned. "It looks like a O'Neill habitat, but smaller." Redford nodded. "You are correct in your assumption, Cynthia. It is the Drazen version of an O'Neill habitat, scaled down to be mobile. If their jammers were active, we wouldn't be able to see it." "Is it armed?" asked Saratan Deshire. "According to the probe's sensors, it is equipped with several PD turrets, anti-asteroid kinetic projectile launchers, and what appears to be hangar bays. The number of fighters and bombers that thing could house, including gunships and maybe even frigate-class ships and drones, is terrifying to consider," Redford answered. "And we're supposed to take it down?" asked Sabraska Kaspars with incredulity. "If we strike blindly, we would be easily destroyed. The cattle ship's defenses are staggering, but it is virtually worthless in the offensive. The Drazen have positioned themselves in a defensive perimeter around the cattle ship and that shipyard," Redford pointed out. "It seems that the rebels and pirates didn't make things easy for the Drazen. 2 of the destroyers are heavily damaged, and the cruiser docked with the shipyard seems to lack shields." He hummed deeply, and with a thought, the map moved closer to the 7th rocky planet and the 1st gas giant. "But something is wrong. The debris fields showcase signs of battle, but aside from 2 Drazen destroyer carcasses, the amount of destruction would suggest the Drazen should have suffered considerably more losses." "You're right, Commander," Galt agreed, crossing his arms. "I've seen similar results before when dealing with pirates. Syndicates and other pirate groups often join forces for an assault. Problems arise when it's time to divide the winnings. Betrayal is the order of the day and a far too common practice among rivals. Position yourself in an advantageous position amid your enemy and fire before they can respond." "But wouldn't such a dishonorable tactic imply that the Drazen and these lowly rebels were working together to some capacity?" Fabian Deshire asked in disgust. Galt nodded. "It is the most viable explanation. That station was almost as big as Woodshaft, and it was turned asunder. The other station is missing, which means it was destroyed utterly, or the cores were overloaded to deny the Drazen an easy victory. There are smaller debris fields scattered across the system, likely what remains of the defensive satellites and outposts." "What of the 2 destroyers?" Lupin Lusanto asked. "Why have they broken away from the rest?" "My guess is that at some point a probe was sent from Kaltashi, and its arrival alerted the Drazen. See how the ships maintain a safe distance from any possible entry point?" Redford asked as the map moved to show the 2 destroyers in patrol. "They'll be able to intercept any small-scale assault by themselves, or reunite with the rest of the fleet if the enemy force is large enough, escaping without suffering any damage." "Honorless abominations," said Fabian with disdain. "Victory doesn't care about honor," Wyatt commented, earning a short-lived glare from the Deshire siblings. He didn't notice it as his attention was fixed on the map. "Commander Redford, is victory an option?" "Defeat is likely if we move thoughtlessly," the commander replied, crossing his arms and humming deeply. "Our greatest asset remains our ability to remain hidden. Thanks to technician Jincho, we arrived in secrecy. If we face them head-on, we will be destroyed. Divide and conquer," muttered the aged commander. Wyatt observed the map in more detail, focusing on the debris field, the planets, and their positioning relative to the Noir Navios as it approached the edges of the system. It would take several hours before their arrival in the system, giving them a significant advantage. How to use it was the problem. "Redford, how many cattle can that ship house?" Clara asked with a coldness that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone present. "A few million at least, my princess," Redford answered without hesitation. "They're above the planet that once proudly bore the name Bastanel." "Are they trying to restock their cattle?" asked the princess. "More than likely. Drazen aren't picky with their feed. Raiders simply have a preference for the flesh of other sapients," Wyatt replied, eyes narrowed. "They want to have as much cattle as possible. I think the Drazen are trying to turn the planet into a giant farm after giving themselves a feast. Tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of humans ripe for the taking. How many more Drazen will come and establish a foothold while we murder each other?" Wyatt is correct. Against such terrible odds, we can't stand down. We must fight and end this nightmare before it begins. Redford, you have my absolute permission to do what is necessary. But do not destroy the cattle ship unless you absolutely can't find a way to disable or cripple it. Do everything in your power to preserve it. The souls aboard that ship must be saved. Understood? Clara commanded with unflinching, profound authority that left no room for discussion. Redford bowed his head. "I shall do my best, Your Majesty." Turning to Wyatt, he continued, "Wyatt, you will be in charge of our wing. The command of our fighters is yours." Under other circumstances, the weight placed upon his shoulders would have made him tremble with doubt and sick to his stomach at the idea of a lowly commoner leading such a force. But these were not other circumstances. Wyatt saluted and said with undying determination, "As you command, sir." "Our first course of action is to peel at least one of their ship away from the main force. We either destroy or cripple the vessel before allowing our stealth system to hide us from their sensors. Their scanners and jammers will be troublesome. But if we move and strike against one or two ships at a time, victory can be ours," Redford explained, as the dozens of plans and strategies he'd formed beforehand swirled in his mind now with solid information to pitch them again. Some were discarded, others modified, and new ones took shape as he analyzed his possibilities. "There," he muttered after a few moments of contemplation, and the map zoomed to the first gas giant, more specifically to the debris field that once was a large station. "More probes 2 and 4 closer to that location. Then trigger an overload, Lusanto." "Sir?" Lupin asked, confused. "Do so. That shall be our first move. The Drazen are bound to send a ship or two to investigate. Wyatt, once we pass the exterior gas giant's orbit, deploy all fighters. You know what to do next, but remember, you are in full liberty and command. Do as you must." Wyatt smiled. "Understood, Commander." As Redford began to issue other instructions, Wyatt focused on the map and the red dots that marked the Drazen ships. "Die! Die! Die! All of you, die! Die in a fire!" he chanted internally with righteous hatred. There was no turning back now.